Hello everyone, I'm Tarrasch Setup. I'm a FIDE master from Turkey, and I have been doing coaching for the last 6-7 years now. And I have taught to people of various ages and levels, from the complete beginner to the advanced, or from the age of 5 to the age of 45. I have taught chess, and I have enjoyed it a lot, almost as much as playing. And it has turned itself into almost a full-time profession for me. Although by profession I'm a mechanical engineer, I have been depending on chess lessons for quite some time now. And I also gain still immense pleasure from playing, from teaching, from immersing myself in the fascinating world of chess. And I hope I will be your company in this very adventurous and fun journey into the complexities of chess. And you will see if you learn chess to some degree that you can understand the mechanics of the game, that it is such an intellectual pleasure uh, that you won't never give up. So I liken chess actually to an addiction. So it's like an addiction which you cannot give up. And I hope that throughout, if you decide to take lessons from me throughout our lessons, you will both improve and have fun and learn about the chess culture, learn about its history and the great players of the past, maybe their stories also sometimes, and the beautiful moves and techniques and maneuvers they employ. And maybe also it will help you like how to think a bit more strategically, or how to think about your opponent's um, threats, to understand and to show empathy, which you can apply in other fields of life as well. And the lessons, when it comes to the lessons, my technique is that the lessons should be as interactive as possible. So it should never be like a passive learning session. So you should think as much as you can, and you should try to find things yourself. And my mission as a coach is just to guide you in that process. It's not like to make you recite some things or to make you memorize some things, but you will learn yourself actually, but I will just act as a guide. So for that purpose, I always begin lessons with few questions. And today I want to share with you a nice model game in classical French endgame. And for that purpose, I have chosen two examples, fairly recent examples. And I want to ask you these positions and then move on with the model game. And later, after the model games, we will look at these positions again. The first position is from the game Giri versus Alexander Fier from Brazil in 2014 Olympiad. It was played. So how did Anish Giri play in this position and gain advantage later? What kind of plan did he employ? Maybe you can stop the video and think yourself a bit. Okay, now let's move on to the second question. This is a game between Nikita Vidyukov, a very strong Russian grandmaster who was 2700 for a while, and I believe still is. And his opponent is Fagin, and this is a game from the 2016 European Cup. And how did White play in this position, and what kind of a plan did Vityukov employ? Okay, maybe you have found the correct move, maybe not, probably not. So, but once you know a model game, so in this end game, this should come very easy to you actually, these two questions. So today we will look at what I believe is the model game for this end game. And this is a fairly old game actually, like a more than 100 years old game. And but knowing this will lead you to find the right move and the right plan in a given position in this variation, or let's say in this pawn structure. So let's move on to the model game immediately. This game was shown to me by a chess coach. Although I have never had a coach, I took few lessons from an international master, and he showed this game in one of the sessions, and it just stuck into my memory. And just because knowing this model game, I have gained several points. I have scored several nice wins in this endgame with white. So let's look at this position. We jump to the position immediately. We don't check the opening for now. And let's try to understand. So this came from a French defense. So from e4, e6, d4, d5. So and then white pushed e5, as you can see, and f4, and black pushed at a certain time c5, and then these c and d pawns were exchanged, and we reached the following pawn structure. So what do we see when we look at this position? We see that white has a bishop which is not so bad because it can potentially attack black pawns. But black has a very bad bishop because its own pawns are hindering the freedom of the bishop. So this bishop cannot be effective, at least in this moment. What can black try to do? Maybe he can try to deploy this bishop to here by pushing b4, a5, things like this, and come with the bishop to an open diagonal. But it doesn't seem to be very likely, or at least white will try to avoid that. And okay, knights are there, two knights, two rooks, nothing much going on there. But also, because black pushed these pawns, we see that the dark squares here are also weak. So, for example, if the pawn could come to b6, it could be a bit better for black actually, but because he pushed b5, now if you take out all the pieces and just leave the kings and pawns, then the white king can come like this and try to enter from c5. If the pawn will be on b6, then white king would have no entry through c5. So again, we see that in a potential pawn endgame, it might also be beneficial for white, this feature of the position. And okay, how should we play in this position as white? So here, the white player, the famous Siegbert Tarrasch, he was called the teacher of Germany actually, and he had a very successful chess career. He was a world championship candidate but lost to Emanuel Lasker, and his books were one of the best sold chess books of all time, which I also recommend to you. And he was a great player, especially he had a very good positional understanding. So the Tarrasch plan is as follows. So first of all, he wants to control this square at all times. He doesn't want black to move the pawn, because if you consider that black will put his bishop on b7, then if you let him play d4, then his bad bishop and my good bishop will be exchanged. So we don't want this. So he wants to control this, and he wants to blockade this pawn. And what is the best blockader piece? It is of course the knight. So the first move is understandable. So he moves knight to e2 and then wants to come to d4. So black played bishop d7, white played knight d4. So this is our first accomplishment and the first stage of the plan, because our knight is now very nicely on d4 and blockading this pawn. And even it might be useful when, for example, black tries to undermine with f6, then e6 will be weak and our knight is attacking e6 also. So, okay, black played rook ac8, and this now the second part, which is very important also. White comes with the king to e3. Why is that? Because, first of all, we want to control the d4 and e4 squares once more, and it will never hurt us. First of all, after, for example, if he plays knight e4, we can already gain a pawn. And second, if these knights are exchanged, our king will be closer to d4 and maybe later a potential entry to c5. So for these aims, white comes with the king to e3. Now, okay, so far so good. So here black played rook e8, and here to find this move is very nice, but only if you know the plan you can find such a move. So white played rook f2. Why is that? Because, okay, first of all, rook is protecting c2, which might be a potential target of attack for black. And the second thing, which is the most important thing, of course, is that white wants to transfer the bishop to d3. This is the third stage of the plan, to put the bishop on d3. So, okay, black played knight b7, bishop f1, knight a5, and now he wants to come to c4. So, but let's say he moved to c5. Then we could still play bishop d3, and if he takes, we take with the pawn. This is very important in this structure, to take with the pawn, not with the king, let's say here, but almost always we have to take with the pawn. Why is that? Because, okay, the c file is opened, but because of the knight on d4, black cannot come to c2. So even if black has the open file, it cannot do anything useful because rook cannot come to the second rank. And in many cases, white can just exchange the rooks, and this is something we want because we want a good knight versus bad bishop endgame, which we can win fairly comfortably. So it might lead to an exchange of rooks, which will be to our advantage. And the second issue with the pawn on d3 is it's covering these two squares very, very nicely, and especially c4 is very important. So we can take the knight out somewhere, and we can even put our king now on d4 safely, because d3 pawn is protecting c4, so there we don't need to fear rook c4 checks. And then our king will be on d4, and already after an exchange, potential exchange of rooks, we will come to c5 and win the game. So we don't need to fear such an exchange of bishop and knight. Actually, it is in our favor, because then we are left with a good knight versus bad bishop, with a classical example of this. So in the game, he played knight a5. So he wants to come knight c4, b3. White needs to avoid that. h6. Now bishop d3. Now this is what I call the Tarrasch setup. King is on e3, knight is on d4, bishop is on d3, and we have reached this setup. Now, okay, now what to do? So black tries to exchange the knights. White accepts, okay, and then puts the king on d4. Now there is a transformation again. Knights disappeared from the board, but now we are left with a good bishop versus bad bishop endgame. And there are two rooks, of course. And here comes the final stage of the plan. White king is very nicely on d4, always ready to infiltrate through c5. But without opening up the position, white could hardly achieve anything. So we should open up the position. How can we open up? So to play like a4 doesn't seem very possible now, because it will lead to some pawn weaknesses on our side. Black could, for example, take on a4, and then he will be attacking on a4. And maybe it is better for now to leave these pawns. Because of that, we don't want to give any targets of attack to our opponents in such a dominating position. So the most obvious candidate is the king side. Here, perhaps we can open up the position by playing g4, h4, maybe g5, or first h5 and then g5. And then we will open up the position here. We will use our rooks. And if the rooks are exchanged, we are still happy, because we are ready to infiltrate with the king and then capture these pawns. Let's see how Tarrasch made this plan. Bishop d7. Immediately he begins with g4. Bishop c8, h4, g6. Now comes rook to h1 because he wants to push h5 at some point. King g7, and now he pushes h5. And now the game is won for black because he cannot avoid the opening of a file, and this would lead to a catastrophe. So rook h8 was played, rook f2. White is doubling before opening up. Bishop d7, and here comes g5. So making sure that a file will be opened. hg5, fg5, rook takes, gh, rook takes. And now white has achieved what he wants. So he has an open file, his rook is active, and his king is still on d4, very nicely blockading. Black bishop is still behind the pawn chain, and white is ready to make some threats like rook h7. So black played king f8 in this position, rook h8, check, king e7, and in this position maybe white made the only mistake. Actually, it's not a mistake, let's say. The real mistake comes later, but here he could have won in a very, very nice way. So he played here first g6, which is not a bad move, but there is a very interesting move, rook h7 here. And the point is, after, for example, king f8, it might seem like it is a repetition or something like that, but now comes g6, because fg, bishop takes g6, and now look at this wonderful position. The black bishop cannot go anywhere because it is pinned. We can capture the rook. The rook, when it goes anywhere, rook a7, b7, white will be ready to come to c5 and d6. So rook is stuck there. And king is okay, king can play, so king can go to g8, but then comes rook f7, and again there is no way that black can play, because even king h8 now loses to rook e7, and then comes bishop e8, which is unavoidable, and white will win a piece. So this position will be a Zugzwang actually, and after black runs out of pawn moves, let's say b4, bishop h5, a5, bishop g6. You see, just white is just waiting black to run out of pawn moves. a4, bishop h5, we are waiting. A takes b3, a takes b3. And now, for example, rook b7. And okay, now this is a bit another finer detail. So now king c5 runs into rook b5, and after king d6, now black has time to play bishop e8, and we don't want that. So that's why now white changes the strategy and goes to e3, and then f4, g5, and then f6, and this way white will win. So king e3, for example, rook c7, king f4, and now black rook cannot come with check, so it cannot unpin. Black cannot unpin his bishop, so black cannot get rid of this. So fg6, bishop takes g6, and in this position, g6, after g6 actually, black took on f takes g6, white took on bishop takes g6, and in this position, black played b4 to, to constrict these pawns here, and here white made the only mistake, let's say only real mistake in the game. He played rook h7 check. He could have won easily if he played bishop d3 in this position, and attacking this pawn, and if a5, rook a8, and the pawn will be lost. So, but he chose rook h7, and after rook h7, black moved king d8, bishop d3 came again to attack this, and here he made an unfortunate move, rook c3. If he had played rook c6, Now he would have covered a6. e6 is covered twice, and for now black is protecting both of his weaknesses. And strangely, although white is of course still very better in this position, much better actually, but white has almost no way to improve his position. Even if he comes to f6 like this, I have checked this position a bit and I failed to see a clear way of gaining advantage in a winning advantage, let's say, in this position. After rook c3 in the game, white played a good move a3, because if he takes, of course, we will take the rook. So after a5, rook h8, king e7, and here black player resigns, Teichmann, because after king e7, rook a8, for example, comes and we are attacking a5, and after, for example, a move like rook c7, we will just play a4 and then take on a5, and then b4 will be lost also, and then we will win with our pass pawns. So as you see, in this game, white player employed a clear plan. First of all, he constructed the Tarrasch setup, as I call, bishop on d3, knight on d4, king on e3. And if the knights are exchanged, the king comes as the blockader to d4. And then we open file and make our rooks active in many games on the king side. But sometimes even on the queen side we can do this. And if the rooks are exchanged, then we can just win the bishop endgame. If one rook is exchanged, also we are happy. If we are closer to the bishop endgame, if the knights are exchanged, I'm talking about after the knights are exchanged, then we are happy actually. Or if the knight takes the bishop in some way, so we are also very much happy playing a good knight versus bad bishop endgame. So seeing this game served as a model for me, and as I said, when I play such a position, I always try to construct this setup and then follow the Tarrasch plan and try to open some file for the rook and then maybe exchange the rooks and try to win in the endgame. And let's come back to the questions. So what is the correct move here? So we already see that the bishop is on d3 and knight is on d4. What is missing? A king on e3. So this is exactly how Anish played. Rook e2, king f2, and king e3. We see there is one more light piece pair which will disappear now. Knight takes d4, knight takes d4. But also in this game, the Tarrasch setup proved to be very worthy. So black played rook c3, rook e1, h5. So black is trying to block the king side, and here comes b4, bishop c8, and a4. So now in this game, white has shown that white can also play on the queen side and open this side, and here bishop c7, a takes b5, and this time the white rook infiltrates through the queen side, and now after this, now the weakness on b5 is telling. King d8, rook a8, king e7, rook 5 a7, g5, and after f5 black resigns because okay, f6 mate is threatened, and after e takes f5 comes knight takes f5 and king e6. Now a very nice move is king d4, and because after, let's say, king takes f5, we can just take rook takes d7, and we also want bishop takes e4 and this, so it is a lost position for black. And let's come back to the second example. Okay, in this game we see bishop is already on d3, king is on f2. What is left? The king should come on to e3, and when this knight should come to e2 and d4. This will be the Tarrasch setup, And we see how Vitigo plays. He plays king e3, knight e2, knight e d4, exactly like Tarrasch did. And he later went on to win this game also. So this shows what do we mean as chess knowledge. Chess knowledge is, first of all, pattern recognition. What is pattern recognition? We see some patterns, like in this game. We have seen, like in the Tarrasch-Teichmann game, we have seen this kind of position of white pieces in this particular pawn structure. So this is a pattern. When we recognize similar positions with similar pawn structure, we can try to employ these kind of patterns in our games. And how do we know such patterns? We have to look at games, actually. Games played by past masters or even present masters. And only then we know how to play in certain positions. So this is one part of chess, pattern recognition, and it is a very important part. That's why we should always analyze and study games of masters. And the second part of chess is the calculation skill. And this we try to develop with solving puzzles, solving many questions as possible. And in the way I work with is I always try to emphasize this pattern recognition, but I also try to do calculation training together. And I think this is very important, and it is one of the most valuable things you can gain from working with me, is to improve your calculation, to try to gain the habit of checking your opponent's threats and try to play accordingly. So I think that these two, the pattern recognition and the calculation skill, is what I value the most and what will be your benefit from having lessons with me. So thanks for listening and hope to see you soon.